few Canadian lives receive the Hollywood treatment. Bill Lishman, the man who flew with the birds, is one.
When I first saw Fly Away Home, it was quite exciting. Of course, it's a big ego thing. There's a Hollywood film made about your life in particular, and there are sort of vignettes in there that you recognize, but it's kind of like looking at your life in reflection through a sort of twisted mirror.
The first day of shooting, I had the walk down, I had the accent down, even the way he looked at geese, you know, I had it all down. I mean, and Carol goes, don't do that. I don't want any of that. Just get the essence of him, get the spirit, get what's behind his eyes.
What lies behind Bill Lishman's eyes is a restless imagination that never stops at the words, "what if?" While most people occasionally have oddball ideas, Lishman actually brings his ideas to life. He is a sculptor, inventor, architect, engineer, and adventurer, a relentlessly curious man who has fashioned art, science, and theater in more than a dozen media. And all the time, he has really been working on only one project: the recreation of Bill Lishman.
Everything for Bill is a voyage of discovery, and around the corner there's something that he just needs to find out about.
Bill plays like a child still.
The first thing he thinks is, how can I build it?
Everybody gets harebrained ideas, and Bill just works at his harebrained ideas.
You know, I'm reluctant to say that because people may think, you know, genius is very close to idiocy. And,
Oh, I think it would be a loss to the world if Bill Lishman ever got a real job.
He would make something and it would be beautiful. You couldn't help but stand back and be amazed.
You go back and listen to him talk about his childhood down here on Miller's Creek and watching the birds and wanting to fly. And here's a man, you know, 40 years later, 40 plus years later, doing it.
Miller's Creek in Pickering, Ontario, was still open space when Bill Lishman was born in 1939. His father worked the farm his mother's family had cleared 4 generations earlier.
He was kind of a wide-eyed, innocent, vulnerable kid in some ways, I would say. Bright, always thinking up stuff, getting into trouble. He has a learning disability, and so academics were really problematic for him. He failed grade 1.
In those days, of course, nobody knew what dyslexia was. It's just that you're slow to learn. And in grade 1 in particular, I remember everybody was reading way ahead of me. The teacher would ask me to read. I'd start telling her what I saw in the picture. It became very frustrating for the teacher, and she'd jerk me around by the ears. My mother, she was a biologist that had worked at the University of Toronto as a lecturer, and we all were interested in all the life that goes on around a farm, and she knew it from a biological point of view as well as an agricultural point of view. She was the first one that talked about the endangered trumpeter swan and the whooping crane at that time, and she, you know, she spoke of them as if they were already gone because there were so few at that time.
Bill looks very much like Dad and in some ways acts like him. Dad was really excellent mechanically, and Bill has inherited that and certainly learned it from Dad.
In the 50s, the romantic notion of a fighter pilot's life captured a child's imagination, including Lishman's.
There was a crop duster would come and he would roll down the back 40 there, just as his wheels off the ground, and pull up before he hit the barn and be under the power, under the hydro lines, and it was, I'd stand right out there and let him fly right over top me. It was such a wonderful feeling to see this thing. Oh boy, I wanted to get up there and fly.
He wasted little time. At age 13, frail, short, and skinny, he joined the Air Cadets in nearby Oshawa.
At 13, I looked like I was still 10, and I was only about 5'2" at the time, and they had a very difficult time even finding a uniform for me, but nevertheless, I signed up when I was in the Air Cadets.
He was always inventing things and playing with things. I can remember one time he brought a portable radio in that he had made himself, and in those days, I mean, that was 1952, they were few and far between.
Yeah, I joined Air Cadets to learn to fly, and every Tuesday night you'd hitchhike. It's about 10 miles over to Oshawa, and most of what you did there was march, but you did take classes in the theory of flight and meteorology, etc. And I I passed my ground school, went to take my medical, and I failed my colorblind test, and I failed the lantern test, and they said, you're grounded. So there was no flying. It was a big disappointment.
And it was just heartbreaking when he couldn't get into the Air Force.
With dashed hopes, his restless imagination turned to wilder pursuits.
He figured out how to make gunpowder. We went to a one-room school, and there was a furnace with one register above it, and he would go downstairs. The girls in the winter would all be hovering over this one register to keep warm, and he would go down and throw a handful of gunpowder into the furnace, and this big poof would come up, and the skirts would all fly up. Bill would have had his fun for the day.
I was a real rebellious teenager, and I remember we had a cider press on the farm here, and we had a big orchard, so I'd make cider, and I used to sell it to the kids at school. It wasn't hard, but everybody thought it was. It was fun. But anyway, I remember taking the car one time down to a dance in Oshawa, and I had all these jugs of cider that all the guys were buying from me, and I got back, and my father caught me. And he was just livid, and I got into a big debate with him, and the next thing I was out the door. I had a whole lot of things I wanted to do, but I didn't hone in on any one thing. I got a job after the summer was over as a motorcycle mechanic, but I wanted to pursue my artistic career. In the spring of that year, I decided I'd like to go to England, so I thought I would search out my grandfather's wood carving chisels.
It was the late 1950s. Lishman sold his prized Triumph motorcycle for a one-way ticket to England. This now brought him face to face with his fate. His grandfather had been a wood carver, and acquiring his tools would push Bill around a corner in his life.
The tools that Bill refers to were his grandfather's tools, and they'd been given to me by another uncle. And when Bill visited us, it was obvious that he was going to have more use out of than I ever would, so I passed them on to him.
Then I went around and visited a few wood carving shops and spent some time in wood carving shops learning the techniques of wood carving and how to sharpen chisels, etc., from the professional wood carvers in England.
What he needed now was formal training.
I came back from England in June of that year, and then the following fall enrolled in the Ontario College of Art. The trouble is I didn't have any money. I needed about $400 or $500. So my father co-signed a loan at the bank, and I went and borrowed this money. It wound up with that I had about $6 a week to live on. And even those non-inflated times, $6 a week was pretty tight because I had to pay rent for, for a room and live downtown and feed myself and buy art supplies and I ran out of money by Christmas. I was broke. At that point, I decided that that's my main thing in life, is to be a sculptor, because I felt so natural at it.
By 1962, Bill Lishman knew he would be a sculptor, but he hadn't yet found his medium. It lay waiting for him in an old blacksmith shop he rediscovered near his home.
I'd been in this blacksmith shop when I was a kid, but he died, and he died in '58, and the place had just been shut up. So I went and saw Edna Green, who was the lady that owned the blacksmith shop, and told her that I wanted to start a career as a wood carver, and she said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll let you use the shop for free for a year, which was great. She more or less opened the doors to me, and my friend Robin McKenzie and his brother Brian, the three of us, started working in that shop in the fall of '62.
Lishman was a wood carver, but he was drawn to the metal tools around him. They had history, romance, and power.
The way things were done in that blacksmith shop is the way it had been done at the time of Christ. It was that kind of a thing. There was no electric welding or gas welding. It was all done in the forge. And then a woodworking shop in behind, because he made wagons and paint shop up above. So it was quite a nice complex, this shop. When we got the forge working and the smoke was coming out and the doors were open, it turns out that Walter had a bunch of old friends that used to come in and hang out at the shop every day, and they all had their sort of seats around there. While Walter was working, they would hang out in the shop and chat with him, and that was his social life. Well, they filed back in gradually and took up their old seats. I'm working on the forge trying to make something out of iron, and of course I'm a greenhorn at it. I don't know what I'm doing. So one of them say, well, Walter used to do that this way, and they come up and they show me how Walter used to do it. So they showed me a whole lot of different things about how to work on the forge, how to get the fire right, how to do a forge weld, and how, you know, what heat to hit the iron at, etc.
Not hot enough, Bill.
Not hot enough on the... Yeah, it was the ghost of Walter Wilson that really showed me how to be a blacksmith.
If he had what he wanted, it didn't seem that way for long. It was the 60s after all. He closed up shop and headed south in search of adventure.
I'd been working in this shop, and a friend of mine said he knew two doctors that were on their way to South America with a beat-up old Land Rover, and they needed somebody to keep it herded together in the parts department. It didn't make it past Mexico. It was a kind of on its last legs, and we pulled into the San Miguel de Allende, and it was a most amazing place. It was beautiful.
Just as the Land Rover's engine cooled, a new change was warming in Bill's life.
When we wheeled in here were these three beautiful blonde women that stopped us, and we got out of the Land Rover, and they turned out to be Canadian, so we had a nice little chat with them.
And we saw a car with Ontario license plates, so of course, you know, hey, who was that? You know, hi, we're from Ontario too, and we had just a brief conversation.
I decided to stay in San Miguel de Allende, and I looked at perhaps getting a job teaching art in the local art school there, but it was mostly elderly painters that were there as sort of it looked like more of a retirement home than a dynamic art school. I preferred to go across the road, and because there was a blacksmith shop there where there were 16 guys hand making all kinds of Mexican art, and so I worked there.
He pursued art, and he pursued Paula. He was 27, she was 17.
It was probably weeks or almost a month later, he came and knocked on the door, and I answered the door, and I was upstairs on the roof of the house trying to do my chemistry.
I'm an expert in chemistry. I excelled at it in school, so I said, well, I can help you with your chemistry, and it was pretty good chemistry. But I didn't ask her age. I thought that would be a silly thing to do. I figured she was somewhere around 20.
We go for breakfast and shop, and, you know, we spent a lot of time talking together, and it kind of really grew very gradually. It was much more of a nurturing situation. I guess because he was older, it didn't really dawn on me that he was in kind of my, you know, sphere of boyfriend type influences.
We'd been living together in Mexico and planned on getting married when we got back to Canada, and we get in with her parents and drive back up to Thornhill, and she's a high school kid to them, and she's going back to high school, and I'm thinking, ooh, what have I got into here? A couple of days later, we announced to her parents that we're going to get married. Well, they went into total shock. They sent their daughter off to Mexico to get a sort of a broader education. She comes home with this hippie artist that doesn't have any visible means of support.
When we sat down in a family group and Bill said, you know, we were thinking of getting married, my dad said, well, maybe this would be a good time to send Paula to Europe.
And I said, that's great, I've never been to Europe.
So I guess they realized that it was going to happen.
We promised we'd wait a year before we got married, and they were kind of hoping that I'd go away in that year, but we endured.
As he went through his life, he really earned the admiration of both of his parents and my parents. I mean, now my dad calls me and talks to Bill. He doesn't even talk to me. You know, Bill and he are great buddies.
Back at the shop in Greenwood, Bill Lishman was an unknown with a major commission ahead of him, a metal sculpture for the Pascal hardware chain. He needed a vision. He found it in a scrap heap.
There was a whole pile of junk from the blacksmith shop. And so I started welding together nuts and bolts and all kinds of things. I made this first mural, one of many, and it was great fun to do because it was taking all these found objects and putting them together in all kinds of juxtapositions and creating machines, and Pascal's loved it. It worked exceptionally well for them, and they made it their logo, and then from about every year, when they open a new store, they gave me a commission to do, and I think I did 20 altogether. Today I can walk into a junk pile and pick out something and I can tell you what it is, because I probably 50 tons of junk float across that shop floor.
Bill occupies a very unique position in Canadian sculpture in the 20th century. Bill's best works are figurative, and his best figurative works are animal sculptures. And he has a genius for capturing the gesture.
Lishman's next commission was a double leap forward. He discovered animal forms and learned the art of self-promotion.
A friend of mine had lent me an apartment in the back of his gas station in Greenwood, so he'd just revamped the restaurant, so it was called the Paddock, and I says, hey, you need a welded steel horse out in front of here to get some attention. And he says, okay. I says, I'll make one for you, and we'll own it jointly. Just let me have the apartment for 6 months. So put together this welded steel horse in front of this thing, all made out of this. It cost me, I think, $10 for the scrap pile. In today's world, the best way to exhibit is in the media, as far as I'm concerned. So I thought, why not show it to a larger audience? And then I came up, a friend of mine and I were sitting around. I said, let's try it like a Trojan horse idea. We'll take the horse and we'll put it in front of Toronto City Hall in the middle of the night. And the next day, of course, everybody wondered where this horse had come from. And it wound up on the front page of all of Toronto papers and went national media on television. So it did the job. Western Fair saw the horse, Western Fair in London, Ontario, and commissioned me to do another horse. And Pascal's asked for another screen. And so inside a year there, I had a lot of money flowing in, was able to buy a house for my new wife and I, and we were sitting pretty by the end of '68.
Sitting pretty forever was not in the cards. Still ahead lay the choice between a welfare check or some startling new creation, like a spaceship. While Bill and Paula may have fled a cold Canadian winter, a blast of reality hit when they returned.
We rented it out to a rock musician, and of course he hadn't paid the bills. He'd run through a tank of oil and another tank, so you know we owed the co-op for 2 tanks of oil.
Went down and applied for welfare. Well, of course, it had a lot of publicity, and everybody equates publicity to wealth somehow, stupidly. And they thought I was pulling the wool over their eyes, but it took me a while to convince them, no, we are broke, we need welfare, and for 3 months we were on welfare.
He figured one way to get off it was to do something like build a lunar module.
I'll go and get a loan, and a good friend that had good credit at the bank introduced me to a banker, told him what he wanted to do, and they lent me the money. The Royal Bank lent me the money.
Well, think about the loan officer who actually okayed that ridiculous idea, you know? Oh, $7,000 for a lunar module. Boy, looks like a good investment for this bank. Sure, why don't you go ahead, Mr. Lishman?
About 2 years ago, in this workshop in rural Canada, an artist named Bill Lishman, along with some friends, decided to embark on their own space program and build a lunar module, like the Apollo lunar modules, in every detail.
I wanted to build an extra room on my house, and I didn't want to go through the hassle of getting a building permit.
The lunar landing module for Bill is just a tree fort made by a grown-up, that's all.
The exact replica of the lunar module put Lishman back in the news.
Well, it seemed to me a rather strange thing to do, but I mean, you know, never a dull moment with this man. I mean, just keep going from adventure to adventure.
That's one small step for man.
If you think about the lunar lander, it is equivalent to the Santa Maria or something along that line. It is an icon in the history of mankind. And I thought, well, someday I'll be able to sell it to a museum, because there aren't any of them around. My timing was a little bit off. I thought somebody would buy it eventually, you know, within 2 or 3 years, but it took 12 years before it did happen. And it was quite exciting the way it did happen, because it went to Japan. Paul and I got invited to Tokyo for the opening, and it was a very pompous affair. We were asked to stand up and take a couple of bows. We stood up and take a couple. What we were standing up and taking a couple of bows for, they purported that we were the NASA team that had designed the lunar lander, and I didn't know that till afterwards. It was a bit embarrassing, because the American ambassador came up to me and shook my hand and says, "That's wonderful." He says, "Where are you all from?" I told him Blackstock, Ontario, and he says, "Oh, I didn't know it was designed up there." I says, "Yep, you know, after we finished the Arrow."
It's a very safe world we live in, a very corporate world we live in, and Bill rebels against all of that.
His rebellion had edge and humor. He turned ancient junk into modern art.
Going through a scrapyard one day, I came across these frame members off a 1927 bus, and they were quite a nice shape, so I bought them from the scrap dealer for about 20 bucks. And while I'd been doing animals and all sorts of things, it was looked as sort of as a craft, folky art stuff. And what was in vogue was more minimalist stuff, that was brightly colored, etc. So I thought, well, I'll just tongue-in-cheek, I'll enter these two frame members. So I call it Yellow Dandelions in a Green Field. It had nothing to do with dandelions or green fields, but it was painted orange and yellow. That was it. And it won the Best Sculpture Award. Marshall McLuhan was quite popular at the time, and he'd said, art is anything you can get away with, and that really underlined it.
Within 2 days of being with Bill, I realized that I haven't gone anywhere near where this guy has gone creatively.
The deeper Lishman went, the more he encountered the animal forms that would make him famous.
The interesting thing about his animals is they are all captured in a moment of drama. It's a lot of teeth and horns and claws. I think that, in a way, he puts a lot of himself into those animals, and that's the way he approaches life fearlessly.
Sculptor, you're trying to capture the essence of the animal, and so it's nice to get the dynamics of it somehow. Something that frees a moment in the. It's like being an actor. You want to catch the essence of the part you're playing.
Now in the spotlight, Lishman's commissions spanned the country, from his 27-foot salmon in New Brunswick to his human tower at Vancouver's Expo 86. The tower, called Transcending the Traffic, was one of the Expo centerpieces. It explored the de-evolution of the wheel. Like most of the rest of Expo, it was eventually dismantled.
The tower still sits in my yard, but all of the sculptures line my driveway. People think I just did this for fun, but they're in storage. They're waiting for the next Expo.
And Bill has that outlook, that kind of uniquely only Bill Lishman would look at the world in this direction. And to have been in there with him and have done that now changes the way I kind of go about things.
Lishman was free to do what he wanted. What he wanted to do was think big. Another brilliant redefinition of old scrap.
Grant Tandy Advertising called me up and said that they had a commercial to do for Chrysler, and it was to introduce the Sundance and Shadow car. They wanted something that looked like Stonehenge. I went away and thought about it. I said, what about crushed cars and put them in the ground and make it Autohenge? And they liked the idea.
Autohenge embodies the artistic marriage of machinery and mind. It was a milestone.
The amazing thing was it was finished. That it was, I had a deja vu. It was just like we'd been there and built it before, and it really made an impression on me about our memories that are probably instinctive or have been passed on from generation to generation. I'd never been to Stonehenge, but the feel I got from being in that replica of Stonehenge was totally amazing.
Witness the complete car. Chrysler, best built, best back.
It stood for about 5 years. It stood a little less than the time that Stonehenge stood. But if you think about it, all the cars in Autohenge weigh less than one of the main stones of Stonehenge. In high school, when you fill out forms for applying for a job or whatever, I always used to put down Druid, and I guess it came to pass.
That same vision could be endlessly redefined, and it could even infect volunteers. For a Canadian, it was only a small leap from Autohenge to Icehenge.
Icehenge, we cut the ice blocks out of Lake Skugog, frozen Lake Skugog, and skidded them to the location. and then erected them by manpower, essentially, except for the lintels. We were mining 1-ton blocks of ice and transporting them a couple of hundred yards.
Icehenge was a poignant meeting of the permanent and the transient. It looked as if it should last 1,000 years. It stood for about 100 hours.
The weather warmed up and it lasted about 3 days. But it did have the image of Stonehenge, and it really did work well too. I've got a new plan on how to thicken up the ice where it's going to be, and maybe it'll stay up for a month or two this time.
Bill constantly recreates himself. So if tomorrow morning Bill got out of bed and said, you know what I want to do? I want to be a polar or Antarctic explorer. Well, that's what he'd do.
Lishman still wanted to fly, and his decision to try again altered his life.
In 1972, I met Mike Robertson, and he was one of the pioneers of hang gliding. And he just lived down the road from me, so watching him fly got me excited about flying again.
He's my worst student because he would never take direction. He would always go off on his own and do his own thing and crash and bash around, which scared the heck out of me that he would hurt himself. And on the other hand, of course, he's my best student. We saw a picture of a guy named Moody in Wisconsin flying one of these easy risers with a motor. And Bill said, that's it. We got to get one of these things and get a motor on it.
It was quite an experience to fly that, because you had to run off the ground and it had barely enough horsepower to get you airborne, and if you stumbled and fell, you had this propeller turning 3,000 or 5,000 or 8,000 RPM right next to your butt. So their handling was a little bit difficult. If you got off wind at all, you were right back into the hill, and boy, I had lots of crashes. In 2 years, I think I logged about 12 minutes of flying.
He persevered. He found and refined the right machine, and then, one day in the air, had an encounter that changed his whole reason for flying.
In 1985, when I read about a fellow by the name of Bill Carrick, who had a flock of geese following his boat on Lake Skugog because they were shooting the IMAX film Skyward. And I'd been up flying with my ultralight aircraft and realized that I was flying at bird speed, and I thought this would be wonderful to get the birds to fly with the aircraft. He'd had a similar idea. He wanted to see if birds would follow an aircraft, and so he was happy to give me some goslings in the following year. So it took 3 years, and I tried it in 86 and 87, but it wasn't until 88 that I had the right combination of aircraft and imprinting to do it, because what worked for a boat didn't work for an aircraft.
And at the time, Bill and his wife were quite convinced that they were wasting their money and their time, and I said, no, you keep on, this is the way the birds work.
The first time I took off from them, they just circled back and landed. So I tried it the next day, and that time I went for a long flight, and they just stuck with me and flew around the aircraft, and I was just bubbling over. It was the most fantastic thing.
It was just heart-lifting, standing on the balcony of the old house and, seeing him go overhead with these birds all following him. Like, it really did work.
And it was a combination of things. One, the achievement of it, but secondly, the visual thing of having that bird right there flying with you was so unbelievable. To see the bird in its own element and to fly with it, it was just joy.
This great joy was about to become an important environmental experiment.
At that point, he got involved with Dr. William Sladen from Airlie Center in Virginia and a few others. And they were the ones really that had the idea that this whole project could be used to help impart in migration routes on endangered species.
The whole thing about what we were doing with geese was just a stepping stone to try and establish migration routes for endangered species, particularly the trumpeter swan and whooping crane.
Lishman's partnership with Joe Duff, a photographer, was an unusual combination. Two artists spearheading an intricate scientific project.
We made a bunch of major mistakes building the aircraft and getting them on time to fly with the birds, and it's critical that you fly with the birds and the aircraft as soon as they're able to fly, and we missed that deadline. I think we came to within about a week once of quitting. We decided that it just was not working.
We thought the whole experiment was going down the tube, and it was very disheartening because we'd borrowed a bunch of money and bought 2 new aircraft.
Luckily, in that week, we had a minor breakthrough. A couple of birds started to follow the aircraft.
Out of that minor breakthrough came Operation Migration. It was exhausting, cold work, leading a flock of birds on a 500-mile journey to re-establish forgotten migration patterns. Some called it lunacy. No one was sure it would work. But in the fall of 1994, the first flock of imprinted geese finally accompanied the ultralight planes from Ontario to Virginia. It was a triumph.
The culmination of it was landing at Airlie, and the day was absolutely magical. The weather couldn't have been more perfect. Beautiful, clear light, and it was just absolute wonderful feeling of accomplishment.
The next spring caught everyone by surprise. The geese headed back north on their own.
We went down on the expected return migration time, and by the time we got down to the birds had gone. We packed the aircraft up in the trailer and headed north and stopped at a few places en route. It wasn't until we got into New York State that we actually got the phone call.
This is fantastic.
I mean, it was absolutely amazing that these birds had found their way home from Virginia with absolutely no help. It was amazing, we didn't really believe that it could happen.
But when they came back, it was like you wanted to hug them. It was just old friends returning, It's because they came back right to the very spot. It wasn't close, it was like right on the front yard.
Adapting this technique to endangered birds was the next step.
Whooping cranes are so endangered that as an interim step, we're going to be working with sandhill cranes. It's a very similar bird, a very close cousin to the whooper, however not endangered.
We're in the middle of the third experiment with sandhill cranes. The first one was just to get up and fly with them, and that we did actually concurrently while we were working on Flyaway Home.
In '97, we tried the experiment again with another flock of sandhill cranes, and this time we planned to do a migration with them. We picked Airlie Center, which is only roughly 500, 600 miles south. Because of bad weather and mistakes we made in imprinting, the birds wouldn't follow us, and we had a difficult time with that until October, November. So we didn't leave on our migration until quite late. The problem, of course, is as soon as we took off, we had severe weather. It was just a battle the whole way. It took us 22 days to cover a little under 600 miles.
The sandhill crane's return journey amazed everyone.
It took off on March 28th from Airlie Center and headed north. And we got the report up here by phone that they had vanished, and the next day they turned up in St. Catharines, Ontario.
Local media is involved. Well, we gotta pick those up, I guess, eh?
They're imprinted on school yards.
They basically made a beeline straight north. They did the journey in basically 24 hours. They ended up 35 miles due west of home base. And I think that kind of confused them a little bit. They knew they'd gone far enough north, but weren't sure left and right. So anyway, the prevailing wind that week was blowing to the west, and they ended up down in London, Ontario. Then they ended up back near Orangeville. Then they broke up. So Bill and I decided that we should collect these birds. So we spent a day, collected all the birds from different schoolyards, 3 different locations, and we trucked the aircraft over, assembled them, and then the next day tried to flight back. They did follow us back, but they never did get close to the aircraft. They would get to within about 200 yards of the airplane, and then they decided that they didn't want to work anymore, so they'd pick a rising column of air and just start to turn. And they would go climb and climb. Maybe that might top out at 2,000 feet, and then they would follow again. The descent into Port Perry, their fledgling grounds, was from almost 2,000 feet. It was a pretty steep descent all the way down. They were very efficient flyers. I think once they reached an altitude of about 1,000 feet, they never flapped their wings again the whole trip, and it was 77 kilometers.
The final landing was the payoff for years of hard work. On top of that, Bill and Joe had made an important contribution to science. On a personal level, it was the realization of a dream.
I've been flying with birds now for 10 years, and it never ceases to amaze or excite me to do that. Probably the thing that sticks in my mind most is my first flights with Canada geese in 1988. That was really exciting because that was a real world first, and it was so much fun to do, and it worked so well, and I was able to document it properly.
Nothing in the Lishman world would escape rethinking. He needed a new home, and for Bill, it was only natural to build underground.
The house that we bought that was on this property was on a hill, a lovely view, excellent in the summertime, but in the wintertime the wind blew right through the thing. So I thought, well, better design a better house. The house design I came up with was 7 interlinking domes underground with each with their own skylight. The purpose, of course, of building underground is to deal with the less temperature variation. There's only 10-degree temperature variation once you get below the frost line, but if you're on top of the ground out in the elements, the temperature can be anywhere up to 60 or 70-degree variation. The way we built it was to get in a big earth mover, remove about 2 meters of soil off the top of the hill. On top of that, lay a layer of concrete, and then build a wireframe structure of the whole house. For too long, we've been in rectangular architecture, been boxed in, and I don't think the human spirit likes to be boxed in. I think our greatest feeling is when we're outside, when we have the sky above us. If you think of the evolution of man, he spent most of his time outside, most of the daylight hours outside. So it gives you the feeling of light and space, no matter what the size of the dome. The other thing is the dome becomes a very sound structural thing. It's like the egg. It can take that pressure without having to use a lot of materials. Halfway through building it, when we just got the wireframe up, the building inspector comes in and he looks around and said, well, what do I know on left? You have to plan all the plumbing and all the electrical and all that, because from there on you put in concrete and cover the whole thing in concrete. All of your services are then cast in stone, more or less, so you have to plan ahead a lot on that. You can't add things afterwards. The big mesh is then covered with a very fine mesh, and then the concrete is sprayed onto that. Putting the concrete on was kind of tricky because you're putting it on a surface that it wants to fall off. Then it's sort of hand work from then on. So when it comes to building it, it's far more labor intensive than the conventional stud architecture that you have today. But my feeling is that this house will probably be here 10 times as long as the current houses that are being built.
The building was eccentric outside, with unique problems inside.
It took a little bit of finagling to put all this square stuff in this round room. The refrigerator being the biggest problem, so I've thought for a long time that refrigerators were not designed properly. I mean, they didn't really get designed, they evolved, and they maybe evolved the wrong way. My solution in this round room was to build this round refrigerator that pops up and you have easy access. The cold air stays in the cylinder underneath, and the cylinder is much easier to insulate because you can make it like a vacuum bottle. And you don't have to open it the full way whenever you need something. If you just need to get the milk out, you just set it to the first level and you get the milk out. Because it's all cutting edge, you don't know what you're doing is right until it's done. And there's a lot of mistakes you're making, and sometimes you're pulling your hair out because you don't have a solution to a certain problem. And it's costing money like crazy, and you think, oh God, all our life savings have gone into this, and we're not going to even have a place to live.
We used to sit in the little chalet and look up at the hole as the house was being built, and kind of, you know, we had this refrain, there's a hole in Purple Hill where all the money goes.
It made me a little nervous on the way through, but it worked out great.
Bill Lishman not only lived his vision, he now lived in it. And word of his accomplishments brought Hollywood to his door.
Well, my agents called and they said, we have this script. We don't have a script, we just have a story. I'm going, well, usually it's better to have a script. But they just had this story about a guy who flew some geese down to the Carolinas or something. I committed to Carol Ballard, the director, and to the project with no script, which is, you know, movie suicide.
When they first came to have a meeting about this, and we walked into my underground house, my domed house, the exec said, "We can't use this in the film, nobody'd believe it." Carol Ballard read my autobiography and handed that to the scriptwriter. Then Columbia's marketing department got a hold of that and figured out what kind of a film would sell.
Look! They're really flying with me! Woo!
I double for Jeff Daniels. They dye my beard brown, and I fly the aircraft that he flies, which was my original Easy Riser, which is, you know, that's in keeping. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm the one that had the fun making the film, not Jeff Daniels.
Dad, watch out!
Oh, Amy! Amy! Amy, stay on the main street! Just stay on the main street!
Hey, Charlie, look at that! Hey, yeah, that must be the Goose Kid!
You know, I got a big kick out of watching it because, you know, particularly a little line like, well, why did you build a lunar lander? Because that line, that line had been asked to me so many times, and to hear Jeff Daniels give the answer.
Every idea that comes through Bill's head, good or bad, pew, off he goes, you know. And it was exciting to play somebody with that kind of mind, with that kind of creativity and imagination. I learned a lot doing the movie. I learned a lot being Bill.
I remembered at the end of the premiere of Fly Away Home, Paula turned to me and she said, "Well, who'd have thunk it?" And I think that's where we all were at.
My mistake was I always talked about my dreams as if I'm going to do it next week. And if you say that enough to somebody, then eventually they all say to you, "Oh yeah, all you are is talk." You know, and so eventually you have to prove yourself that and so you sort of build your own road by doing that.
Idea is not a noun with him. Idea is a verb. It's just something that's bubbling. And you just get around this guy and you can't help but feel the energy. And if you're lucky, you'll get pulled in.
I'm the living embodiment of the old 60s, do your own thing. And it's still a valid statement. So many people get waylaid by saying, well, you've got to get out and find a job that earns you a good living, and then waste their lives doing something they hate. The most important thing is to do something that you love to do, and even if your income is a quarter of what it would have been otherwise, your life will be 10 times better.
He's the oddest oddball that I ever knew, and just maybe, the world needs oddballs sometimes.